right, it's 5:30. We're going to get started in the interest of time, since we know we are probably the last thing between you and the evening activities. So I'm Torben Becker. I'm the current editor-in-chief of the Global EM Literature Review. We have Sean Kieflahan here, our current managing editor, who will be taking over as editor-in-chief this summer, and then Braden Hexam, who is our assistant managing editor and incoming managing editor. So GEMLR has been in 16 years in progress, work in progress for 16 years essentially, 16 year of publication in academic emergency medicine. The mission is to highlight and disseminate high quality global EM research, illustrate best practices in global health, and stimulate additional research. The mission is, and we believe that it actually has contributed to this, which is promoting the further professionalization of global emergency medicine work, global emergency medicine research, global emergency medicine clinical care. It is, and that's very important, not a systematic review or a meta-analysis. My colleague Sean is going to present to you the methods in a little more detail before we're going to get into what you're really here for, which is a selection of the top articles from the 2021 review.
Thanks, Tom. So we do a pretty rigorous methodology that's a big part of this project, and we do this literature search every year from January 1st to December 31st of the year of these search terms that you can see here to try to capture as many papers as possible. And it ends up being a huge number of papers. We have committees that work on this every year to adjust things, to change the search terms. We also have a hand search of journals that typically provide many high-yield articles related to global emergency medicine. So Bulletin of WHO, Pre-Hospital Disaster Medicine, Lancet, and AFGEM. And we used to have several more, but now as they've been reliably incorporated into PubMed, we've removed them and we can use our search string instead. For years, we did a gray literature search, so all the things that don't show up in PubMed that cover interesting global emergency medicine topics. But we found that they never scored high in our system, and so it ended up just being kind of a lot of work for very little yield. So this past year, we cut it for the first time. And so once we screen our articles, we put them into 3 different buckets that we try to classify what is global emergency medicine into. And those 3 buckets are emergency care in resource limited setting, or ECRLS, disaster humanitarian response, and then emergency medicine development. It's hard. One of the things that we try to do is really try to categorize global emergency medicine and define it, which is tricky because it's broad and it's almost kind of vague in a way. So we try to create some objective criteria to classify papers into these 3 categories, and then we look at everything as original research or a systematic review or some other type of review, and that has to do with how we score the papers. Once a paper screens in, so step 1 is the search, and then we have a very large team that goes through and screens all of these articles manually, and some of you in the crowd here I know are part of this team, so you're pretty familiar with it. After articles screen in, then those articles are scored by the next team. So depending on if it's original or if it's review, they have different scoring criteria. And these change every year, trying to decide what is the most effective way to measure up an article. So we look at the actual design, the clarity, the ethics, how important it is, the impact, and then several other smaller categories like do they look at cost effectiveness. One thing that we're going to do this next year, which will be brand new, is we're going to include a score for author equity and looking at is there representation from the country that the research was done in, which is a new thing that was brought about by, as you may have heard earlier, a paper that was done looking at the papers we've included, looking at authorship equity and finding that there is basically none. And we really need to change that, so we can do our small part in our GEMLR review by ranking articles by that. So that's our methods very briefly, and to get into the summary that we had this year, so 44,000 articles were searched, came up in our search string, so it's a huge amount of articles that we went through, and this is an abstract screening going through. After we screened in 444 articles this year, so also quite a large number of articles, and now these 444 go through a full text review, and they get scored. And then the top scoring articles, the top 5% in every category of our score goes into review, and becomes part of our paper where we produce this annual summary that's published in the AEM of what are the top global emergency medicine articles every year by category, and we have 23 articles this year. Our team, we have the leadership team is 4 people, managing editors and editorial board. Then we have 8 editors that manage 30 reviewers split into all of these different teams. So it's quite a large team. We also every year produce a systematic review separately with people that have served as reviewers for a few years. So, and that topic changes. The most recent topic was acute respiratory illness management in low resource settings, which is currently under review with Journal of Global Health. And then many of our editors this has been around for 16 years now, so a lot of editors that were part of the team, as they fade away, we've instituted term limits so that we can force turnover to allow new people to come up and to really try to diversify our team, which has been a big effort over the past few years. Those people that term out, essentially, they become part of our advisory board, so they can still be involved peripherally and we can keep the institutional knowledge. Our current team has 10 countries represented, and we really want to continue to diversify this. So every summer we do a call for new reviewers, and it's really up to all of you as we try to blast it out to spread it through your networks. So with that, I'll turn it over to Braden, who will go through the top articles.
All right, so my name is Braden Hexum. I'm faculty at Rush University in Chicago, and I can say that I've actually been involved at every step of this process. I started out as a junior reviewer. My first year out of residency, I was looking for something to join, and this happened to be it at the time. And I was really excited that I've been able to see this process through all of its kind of iterations. So if you're in the audience looking for something to get involved with, this has been a really rewarding thing for me to participate in. I'm going to give you a taste, just a little taste, of what the best articles that we pulled out of our review this year. And I know that the room setup is a little hard for you guys to see. You're really far back, but you'll just have to wait for the paper to come out to get the full scoop. And I'm only going to present a couple. So at the time that we submitted our slides, we were still kind of finalizing the review for this year. And so these actually highlight the highest scoring of our system of our review this year. And so what's really nice about the GEMLR review is that we look at quality, right? So the scoring process itself goes through a fairly rigorous set of scoring criteria to get to a high level. And so these 3 kind of represent this year's higher scoring articles. So the first one was in healthcare. This is Al Hussein. And was a systematic review and meta-analysis of pneumonia severity scores. And so what they tried to do is really look at LMICs and try to identify, has there been research done in these countries validating the use of many of the scoring systems that you're very familiar with. There's dozens that are out there, and so the review itself went through a systematic review process to identify research that's been done in those countries. Obviously, this is an important topic. Pneumonia in all parts of the world is an important disease process, and trying to identify scoring systems that have applicability in low and middle income countries is obviously very important for public health. So this was a database search followed by a hand search. One of the limitations of this study is it was primarily done by a single author, but validated through some oversight by some additional authors, screening for a fairly rigorous search string, which is in the article if you're interested in reviewing. But they came up with 9,900 records, and of those only found 11 eligible studies that utilized tools that were in the countries of interest. So these 11 studies used 12 different tools. In their criteria, they actually only found studies that identified CRB-65, CRB-65, and CRB as being the only ones that were applicable and available for the meta-analysis. And what they did find was that CRB-65 was probably a little bit better, but if you didn't have the U, you're probably okay too. And so they did identify that both of those scoring systems seem to be valid using both intermediate and severe levels in the scoring rubric to identify pneumonia severity. So they weren't able to really look at other scoring systems because there's just not enough, there wasn't enough data or papers related to that. So this is one of the few reviews that make it into our study this year. We don't have a lot of reviews that end up making it because we do have a fairly rigorous scoring system to identify true systematic reviews and not just literature reviews as primary research. Second study, I really like this one. This was a study in JAMA Open Network on 3 days of oral azithromycin in young children with acute diarrhea and low resource settings. This was a randomized controlled trial. What I really like is that this was done in 36 community health centers and outpatient centers in 11 different countries. So they primarily looked at Sub-Saharan Africa, India, and Pakistan. Bangladesh and Pakistan, and actually had a fairly rigorous randomization process for randomizing children to 3 days of oral azithromycin or placebo. They enrolled 8,200, almost 8,300 children. One of the very interesting inclusion criteria is that children needed to have diarrhea and needed to have some level of dehydration. Excluded from the study were severe dehydration or bloody diarrhea or concerns for cholera. And they also excluded diarrhea with no signs of dehydration. So they're really focusing on that middle cohort of people who need some sort of resuscitation. And in this case, the control group was WHO standard care, so oral rehydration, zinc, and non-antibiotic use. And so they did randomize the other side to getting these 3 days of azithromycin. They actually stopped this study early because they did find that there was no change in mortality or in rate of growth for these children. So they actually redid their power calculation and realized they would have had to enroll another 3 times what their initial plan was going to be to get a sufficiently powered study. So they actually stopped this one early due to futility and came away with the conclusion that there was really no change in mortality for adding antibiotics in kids with moderate and mild dehydration and diarrhea. So really interesting conclusion that WHO standard of care is sufficient in most of these kids. All right. Third is also a randomized controlled trial. This is a really interesting multi-arm study that looked at oxygen versus high-flow nasal therapy versus permissive hypoxia in kids with pneumonia. This was also a really nice, kind of rather large, multi-country randomized controlled trial. So very well done. They randomized kids in 2 different groups. So either hypoxia, like true hypoxia, less than 80%. Those children were randomized into either high-flow nasal therapy and low-flow or regular kind of nasal cannula oxygen. The other group was in the moderately hypoxic, so children with oxygen saturations of 80 to 91%. They were further randomized into 3 different arms. 1, high-flow nasal therapy, low-flow regular standard oxygen therapy, or no oxygen at all, permissive hypoxemia, allowing those children, until they dip below 80, they would not be getting oxygen at all. And so this was kind of a multi-pronged randomized controlled trial. And what ended up happening in this trial, it was also stopped early. Unfortunately, what happened was one of the countries backed out after having an ethical review of that one arm of the permissive hypoxemia. Even though this is rather standard care in a lot of facilities that don't have access to oxygen, that's actually what this study was trying to identify, and that the ethics behind that was probably fairly sound, and they described that in their review of this, in the discussion of this paper. But the one country's ethical review board actually pulled their support of this study, so they ended it early. So that's then they did their conclusions based on 1842 at the end, which was about a third of what they were going for. So again, kind of limited data, but what they found I thought was fairly interesting. Again, the basis of this study is, what do you do when you have limited oxygen supplies and who gets those, right? And what they actually found is, and again, this is a great paper to go back to and take some time to look at the way that they present their data. Really interesting stuff in which the high flow nasal therapy kids, they actually used less oxygen because of the way that the protocol was designed. That was a titrated protocol, meaning they started on room air on high flow nasal therapy, and most of those kids actually did really well and never needed the oxygen titration that was part of the protocol. And so it was actually the regular oxygen nasal cannula kids that used the most liters overall in their care. Really interesting result, and again, might help to determine things like resource allocation, like oxygen use, and how that might actually come about. And what they found is essentially there was very little mortality, statistically significant mortality differences in any of these arms. What was really interesting about this is they claim this is the largest trial of oxygen in children in low and middle income countries. So again, kind of a nice, widely spread out over multiple sites and countries, fairly well done randomized controlled study. That's it. Those are the three. Again, that's the teaser. If you want the full set of the 23 articles that we found as most important to this year's literature review, you have to wait till the article comes out, and we'll show you some more. So please check us out, and I'll turn it back over to Tom to wrap us up.
Thank you. Yeah, if you have any questions, we'd be happy to entertain those. We're also happy to entertain them after this, since we're coming up towards the end of our time. What I do want to point out, though, is that this July, mid-July, around July 15th, we're going to open up the applications again for the new cycle of reviewers. So if you have an interest in becoming involved in this, this project that then is going to embark on its 17th year of global emergency medicine research and evaluating global health research, we'd encourage you to go to our website, GEMLR.org, and complete the application, and would love for you to possibly join the team later this year as we continuously not only pursue this process, but also continuously change our methods, the way we're looking at studies to evolve as well. Just as global health research is evolving, we want to make sure that GEMLR as a project evolves along with that research. So mid-July, GEMLR.org. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for the attention.
Any questions?
All right.
Thank you.
Have fun tonight, everybody.
Thanks for sticking around for the last one of the day. I know it's hard, but we really appreciate you guys being here. Thank you.